Good evening, and welcome to the first of two videos regarding the urinary system and excretion. so, this is the last chapter in Unit 2. Next week we will be having an exam on Unit 2, so keep that in mind. We'll talk about it in class a little bit more. In any event, back to the urinary system. So, if you recall, we started this unit by dealing with the cardiovascular system, the blood, talking about all the things that need to be transported within the circulatory system. All right, we in the last unit we talked about oxygen and carbon dioxide and kind of the round trip journey that they take between the lungs and the body's tissues. In the first section, or the section right before that, we talked about food and how it's absorbed into the small intestine, from the small intestine into the bloodstream, and then transported to all the body cells after a stop in the liver. Now, in this unit, we're going to talk about how metabolic wastes are removed from the body's tissues and transported by the circulatory system up to the kidneys, which are the functional units of the urinary system. So, the one thing that I do want to make very clear is that urine is a metabolic waste. It is a waste that is not that has been inside your cells. Urine and feces are not the same thing. Remember from the unit on digestion that feces is material that never entered your body. Remember, it stayed in the tunnel that is, or the tube, which is your digestive system, and is just eventually egested out. Excretion of metabolic wastes are chemical wastes that went into your cells as one thing, simple sugars or amino acids or whatever, and come out as something else. All right. And obviously, it's a different system, a different method of getting rid of wastes. Your feces are waste from your food, your urine is wastes from your metabolism. So, what are the organs of the urinary system? Well, you have two kidneys under normal circumstances, which are bean shaped and fist sized organs, and their main function is to form urine. All right, you can see that they're not exactly bilaterally symmetrical. Your left kidney generally is a little bit higher than your right. And they are located in the back wall of your abdominal cavity. Now, um, attached to each of the two kidneys are tubes called ureters, and you can see one here and one on the other side. And they are small muscular tubes that carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder. And they do so by the process of peristalsis. All right, think back to where you've heard that term before. So thin muscular tubes that carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The urinary bladder is located here, and this is a balloon-like organ, very expandable, and it stores urine until you expel it from the body. And then finally, there is a tube that leads from the bladder to the outside of the body, which is called the urethra. All right, the tube itself is longer in men than it is in women. If I have to explain that to you, you should probably drop the course right now. But that tube carries urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. Okay, so what are the functions of the urinary system? Well, obviously, excretion is the big one. All right, that's the one we always think about when we think about the urinary system, or the excretory system. All right, the excretion of metabolic wastes. All right, and again, these are not the solid wastes that are stored in your rectum and eliminated through your anus. These are metabolic waste, chemical wastes that come from your cells and are filtered out of the blood by your kidneys. However, the urinary system has other functions as well. Maintenance of the water salt balance, all right, making sure that you're not dehydrated, or that you're not, that your eyeballs aren't floating. Um, Maintenance of the acid base balance, especially in your blood. And finally, and we did mention this earlier in the semester, Hormone secretion. All right, your kidneys actually do produce several hormones, including renin and erythropoietin, and we'll get to those a little bit later on. Now, what exactly are the metabolic wastes that we need to get rid of? All right. Well, first of all, they are mostly what we call nitrogenous wastes. All right, meaning that they are organic compounds that contain nitrogen. The three most abundant of these wastes are urea, uric acid, and creatinine. Now, urea is made by the breakdown of amino acids in the liver. All right. So remember, your amino acids are picked up in the small intestine. They're sent to the liver through the hepatic portal system. And if they're not used or sent out into the body by the liver will break them down and eliminate them back into the bloodstream as urea. Uric acid is produced by the breakdown of nucleotides. So here we're talking about DNA molecules that are broken down. And again, remember that all of your food was once alive. Therefore, it was made of cells. And if it was made of cells, it contained DNA. And so when those nucleotides are broken down, the waste product, the metabolic waste, is uric acid. Finally, you have creatinine, which is produced by your skeletal muscles, well, all of your muscle cells, but mostly skeletal muscle cells, when they break down creatine phosphate. All right. And when we talk about the musculature system next week, we'll talk about what creatine phosphate is actually used for. But for now, we'll just sit on that. All right. So urea, uric acid, and creatinine. Okay. So the kidney is, as I said, you have two kidneys and they are bean-shaped, fist-sized organs. But the internal anatomy of the kidney is broken up into three major regions. You have the renal cortex, which is the outer layer, and it appears kind of granulated. It almost like sand particles, and that's the outer layer of the kidney. The middle layer is called the medulla, the renal medulla. And in the medulla, you have these cone shaped masses called renal pyramids. And this is where most of the excretory process takes place. And then finally, you have what's called the renal pelvis, which is a centralized cavity where urine is collected. It's continuous with the ureter, and so the urine gathers in the pelvis and then passes down the ureter into the bladder. All right. So the cortex, the medulla, and the renal pelvis are the three regions of the kidney. This is a photograph down here. All right, this is a photo. Whoops, I don't know what just happened. This is a photo of a kidney with a couple of the renal pyramids removed. That's what these empty pockets are sitting here. The yellowish portion here is the renal pelvis where the urine is collected. But probably more helpful are these images here. Now, this one shows the renal artery bringing blood into the kidney, and then the renal vein bringing clean blood out of the kidney. And notice the artery breaks into arterioles, which break into eventually into capillary beds, where the blood is exchanged with the excretory system. And all of this takes place inside the renal pyramids. Now, a renal pyramid looks like this. So here's the pyramid, and it's not really a pyramid shape, if you will, but there's one. And so up here, this shows one renal pyramid with a couple of nephrons. Now, the nephron is this whole thing, all right, here. And these are the functional units of the kidney. Now, this kind of hints that there are only a couple of nephrons in each of these pyramids. That's not really true. There are thousands or even hundreds of thousands of nephrons in each of the renal pyramids. The diagram is just simplified so that we can kind of figure it out a little bit. All right. In any event, the nephrons are where the filtration of the blood actually occurs and the exchange of various materials actually occurs. But you can see that the nephrons are connected to these long collecting tubules which dump out into the renal pelvis, and then the pelvis carries the urine right down um, to the ureter and eventually to the bladder. Okay, so that's the anatomy of the kidney on a grand scale. Now let's talk about the nephrons themselves, because that's kind of an important aspect. All right, the nephrons are microscopic. All right, so you can't see them with the naked eye. You have to look at them under a microscope, and they are the functional unit of the kidney. They produce the urine, and you've got more than 1 million nephrons in each of your kidneys. So you've got more than 2 million of these things in your body. And so, what actually happens? Well, this represents what we call the renal artery, and so blood is traveling this way and it branches off into what's called the afferent arteriole, and the blood ends up in a capillary bed called a glomerulus. All right, the glomerulus sits inside the glomerular capsule, and in this portion, the blood is filtered, and almost everything is pulled out. The clean blood then goes through the efferent arteriole into a capillary bed that you see down here. Whereas all of the stuff that was pulled out of the blood, the wastes and the good stuff, goes into the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay. Then it makes its way down through the loop of Henle, or what's called the loop of the nephron, and eventually into the distal convoluted tubule. And eventually the wastes are left here, and they go down to through the collecting duct into the renal pelvis. Now, once everything is removed from the glomerulus, we gotta find a way to get the good stuff back, because we don't want to get rid of everything that's in the blood, just the bad stuff. But in the glomerulus, almost everything is pulled out. And so in the proximal convoluted tubule and in the distal convoluted tubule, the stuff that we want to keep is actually pulled back into the bloodstream. Okay, so what happens in the nephron? All right, well, there are 5 portions of the nephron that you need to be aware of. The first one is the glomerulus, all right? And this is just a knot of capillaries inside the glomerular capsule where you produce a blood filtrate. In other words, everything that's found in your blood plasma is pulled out, except for the cells, of course. The red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, they all stay in there. But all the chemical stuff is essentially pulled out, with a few exceptions. Now, that filtrate then enters the proximal convoluted tubule. And this is a thin layer that allows the reabsorption back into the bloodstream of some filtrate components, all right? The good stuff, the stuff that you want to keep. Then the filtrate enters, what's left in the filtrate enters the loop of the nephron. And this goes down deep into the medulla and then back up to the cortex. This is where most of the water balance stuff takes place. Osmoregularity, we call it. All right. Water comes out and salt comes out as well. What's then still left, either in the blood or in the filtrate, enters the distal convoluted tubule. And in this case, here we have a little bit of active transport. Filtration and reabsorption are all done by diffusion. But in the distal convoluted tubule, you tend to have a little bit of active secretion. And here, these are molecules that weren't filtered out of the original in the glomerulus, and they need to be pushed out by active transport, and that's called secretion. Eventually, what's left enters the collecting ducts, and they tend to join together to form larger and larger ducts, which eventually end up in the renal pelvis, and then the urine is then carried away from the pelvis by the ureter. Okay. Now, how does the nephron actually form urine? So again, three-step process here. All right. The first one, for the love of God. The first one takes place inside the glomerulus here. So the blood, it comes in through one tube, and everything is essentially filtered out by the process of diffusion. And then very clean blood goes out through the efferent arteriole. And in glomerular filtration rather, water, salts, nutrient molecules, and waste molecules all move from the glomerulus to the inside of the glomerular capsule. In other words, they're filtered out of the blood and they form what's called the glomerular filtrate. Now, that filtrate then enters the proximal convoluted tubule, which is this section here. And here, mostly tubular reabsorption occurs. So the nutrients and the salt molecules are reabsorbed from the convoluted tubules back into the bloodstream, okay? Because you don't want to get rid of the good stuff, you want to keep it, okay? And then in the distal convoluted tubule here, there are certain molecules that didn't come out during filtration, and they need to be actively secreted from the inside of the nephron. All right, and sorry, from the inside of the blood into the nephron. Hydrogen ions, for example, penicillin, and some other things are actively secreted. So now, tubular reabsorption and secretion can actually occur in both convoluted tubules, but the proximal one, and proximal just means close or near, that's mostly for reabsorption, and the distal one, which means distant or further away, is mostly for secretion. All right, but you can have a little secretion in the proximal and a little reabsorption in the distal. Now, the last portion down here is for the water-salt balance in the loop of the nephron. And then finally, really the actual last part is the collecting duct, which leads eventually to the renal pelvis and the ureter. Okay, so just as a review, glomerular filtration is when water and small molecules move from the blood inside the glomerulus to the glomerular capsule. Now, large molecules and formed elements, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets remain in the glomerular blood. All right, so the stuff that comes out is filtered out is water, the nitrogenous wastes that we mentioned earlier, urea, uric acid, and creatinine, nutrients like amino acids, fatty acids and glycerol, monosaccharides, and so on, and salts. Those are all pulled out of the blood in the glomerulus. The things that are not pulled out are the formed elements, all right, the blood cells and the platelets, as well as the large plasma proteins. They tend to remain in the blood. Now, in tubular reabsorption and secretion, the reabsorbed stuff are the things that we want to keep. Most of the water is reabsorbed back into the blood from the proximal convoluted tubule. Most of the nutrients, the amino acids, the monosaccharides, and so on, are reabsorbed back into the blood. And salts, to some degree, are reabsorbed back into the blood. Now, some of the water is left non-reabsorbed. Most of the nitrogenous waste is not reabsorbed, and the excess salts are not reabsorbed. Okay. And then secretion is a second way to get rid of substances such as drugs, hydrogen, and creatinine coming out of the blood. All right. One of the ways that they determine that your kidneys are not functioning well is they measure the amount of creatinine in your blood. If it's too high, that tells you you've got kidney damage. But typically, it's removed by an active process of secretion. Okay, so that, my friends, brings us to the end of chapter, or the first video of the of chapter 11, I think this is. Um, but the first video on the urinary system and excretion. So stay tuned for video number 2, and I hope you learned something.